Hello? Can anyone hear me? Want to make sure the sound works. There is a bit of a delay in the broadcast, of course. Hello? Can anyone hear me? Want to make sure the sound works. Okay, hi everybody. Hopefully this is going to work out okay. It's been a little weird not being able to have our secret meetings here for quite a while. So why not try it on the internet like the cool kids do, right? I'm curious, out of the audience we have, who does go to the secret meetings and maybe who's never gone to that or doesn't know what I'm talking about. Of course, you don't have to reveal your secrets or whatever, but we do have that chat box, so people can put comments and stuff in that chat box, and I can see all that stuff. But yeah, anyway, got to be a bit of a host as best I can. It's a little weird talking to a screen, I have to admit. But just want to wait a few minutes so that some people can maybe trickle in here for a second. But anyway, the idea is to talk about the virus panic. Hopefully you're all outraged like me and want to basically go over a few issues wrapped up in this whole mess from a libertarian perspective. So yeah, basically just want to kill a few minutes in case people want to trickle in. That's of course the boring way every live stream starts. And someone mentioned in the chat box that they don't, they've never watched a live stream live, and I think that's also true of me. Usually I just kind of watch them as normal videos, or rather kind of listen to them or whatever with the subsequent recording. So yeah, I guess this is all the trappings of live action. Now, I don't know, I guess let's just get right into it here. Anyone can join as they come along or whatever, but without further ado, let's talk about the virus panic. And let's see here. So, oh yeah, I guess a few kind of introductory notes, of course. If there are technical problems, I don't really know what's going to happen, because to be honest, I've never done this before. I think I've pretty much got it figured out, but if it disconnects, or like if the connection goes down or something, I don't know if we just restart this stream. I think that's likely the case, or maybe have to start up a new one. If that's the case, I guess go to the channel. Hopefully it's not too annoying and we don't have a bunch of problems, but it should be okay. Main thing I think will just be hopefully the sound can be good, and this can be useful for somebody. What else? Yeah, obviously it's not like a conference call kind of thing, or like a big party chat, but we do have the chat box, so throughout we can look at what people are saying. If they've got some questions along the way, that might be cool. Or if people want to share some links in there to spread propaganda, or maybe argue amongst themselves, that's always fun. But I guess that's about the limit of the interactivity. Although I guess if you had my phone number or something, you could give me a call and we could pretend it's like a radio program, but we're not really that sophisticated, so I don't know if we're cut out for handling that. So yeah, if we get disconnected, that could be a problem. Hopefully everything will work okay. And if the chat is cool for people to use, some people might not be like actually able to type while they listen or whatever, well, that's fine. We'll try and pop over to the live chat every once in a while to see if there's questions or comments, kind of as we go through some of this stuff I put together. So let's see, what else have we got here? So I want to start with a quote which will resonate with people like us right now. We will understand what's going on here. This is the great H.L. Mencken, and he says, "The urge to save humanity is almost always a false face for the urge to rule it." We're living in this crazy time. I have never seen anything like it, but it is basically a complete mass hysteria. I don't know if anyone out there thinks of anything that compares to this. Personally, I've never seen such an amazing amount of destructive public policy and outrageous foolishness and people cheering for all this stuff, all for the sake of being saved. But what will people sacrifice to try and protect themselves from the evil virus? It's scary to think about. The mob is always dangerous. The mob tends to be the enemy of liberty. And when you get the mob all freaked out about parasites and disgusting things and viruses and people being sick, well, it triggers that disgust response in people. So I think it pushes them in a more serious way towards authoritarianism. And there's actually some social science research about that. That's kind of interesting. It talks about like the connection between authoritarian political tendencies and proximity to parasites or something like that. But interesting idea. Now, libertarians are always being tormented by the fact that we think we've got the world pretty figured out. We at least think we have a better political ideology with which to judge policy and such. And so sometimes it's hard to hear like the economic ignorance or the lack of ethics in some of the day-to-day things, but all of that is cranked up to 10 now for what we're hearing, where we are assaulted with the worst arguments, the craziest public policy suggestions I think I've ever seen. This sums it up nicely. People can't even pass the test of self-reference, like our meme character here, where she says it should be illegal for you to choose to leave your house because you could harm me if I choose to leave my house. That is an amazing anti-liberty position, and this isn't really a satire or a parody. It's just kind of bringing one of the existing arguments behind this lockdown to its most absurd position. And it's just painful sometimes. And you get these just absurd things, which is just brought out here in this kind of funny online comment, where someone says eating food is banned until nobody chokes for 15 straight days. And that's kind of like what they're talking about with some of this lockdown stuff. No, you got to be locked down until no one gets sick again or no one ever dies. It's a pretty major thing to put us on the hook for. And of course, like I said, a lot of people are cheering this along. I mean, libertarians aren't necessarily the best at political activism and stuff, so sometimes we might be armchair quarterbacking a bit, but people are just rolling over and taking some of this amazing lockdown policy without batting an eye, it seems. Or, like I said before, they're cheering for it. They're looking up at the priestly medical class, telling them what they need to do and how they need to turn their lives upside down. And they're begging for guidance, and it's weird and kind of creepy when the people look to politicians and bureaucrats that way. All right, what else have we got here? So this is an emotional time. Personally, I have been just pissed about the things I hear every day, and the media, the crazy statistics, the crazy arguments. I'm really mad, and that's why I kind of called this a angry live stream, kind of tongue in cheek. But pardon me if I sound emotional about this, because I'm not a really I don't know, excitable person, I guess, but I am emotional about this. I'm pissed off at the sheer weight of the stupidity and injustice before us here. And it's all over this virus. It's not even like a crazy alien invasion or something interesting. You know, the other side of it, and you can kind of feel this a little bit as well, but just despair as to where we're heading. And hopefully people don't get too sad. I think you can die if you get too full of despair. That's a rumor I heard anyway. I don't know. Moving into a little more kind of direct virus talk, I wanted to start with this quote from Dr. David Henderson. And he's kind of attributed as one of the guys who's behind like ending smallpox. So a very esteemed epidemiologist. I want to read this quote of his from a little while back. Now, he died a few years ago. He said, "The interest in quarantine reflects the views and conditions prevalent more than 50 years ago, when much less was known about the epidemiology of infectious diseases and when there was far less international and domestic travel in a less densely populated world. It is difficult to identify circumstances in the past half-century when large-scale quarantine has been effectively used in the control of any disease. The negative consequences of large-scale quarantine are so extreme: forced confinement of sick people with the well, complete restriction of movement of large populations, difficulty in getting critical supplies, medicine and food to people inside the quarantine zone, and that this mitigation measure should be eliminated from serious consideration." So this is no libertarian guy. He's just kind of a regular doctor person, scientist man. I don't really know that he has an ideological skin in the game, if that makes sense. But he says quarantine is kind of a stupid idea. So we don't want to make an argument from authority, but if someone like this casts doubt on this whole idea, well, we'd better be careful when the politicians, the bureaucrats, and the mob start suggesting this is the best way to go. Okay, so it's also interesting to do some comparisons when you think about the craziness that we're seeing now and some of the past pandemics, say in the last 100 years or so. One of the more interesting examples, which was dug up by Jeffrey Tucker over at AEIR, was that Woodstock, the great kind of rock outdoor concert, was held during a pandemic. And people didn't really seem to care. So this all relates to the Hong Kong flu pandemic, as it was called, or I guess the H3N2 pandemic. And it went from Hong Kong to the United States in December 1968, and it lasted about a year, and it had kind of two peaks, sort of like the way they predict this whole Wuhan virus will go. There will be two peaks, two waves. So this Hong Kong flu kind of had that. And it was pretty serious, so I guess, and this, we can look back, and they've kind of done the math and looked at the data and stuff, so they have a pretty good idea of what happened, but they say 100,000 deaths in the U.S. Well, that's quite a lot. And the U.S., could get there by the end, but the world didn't shut down for the Woodstock, or not the Woodstock pandemic, the Hong Kong flu pandemic. The media talks about it a lot. People were a little more cautious. But apparently, there's no evidence that the world shut down and had this kind of anxiety attack over getting sick, or the risk of getting sick. I find that very interesting. What did these people believe that we don't believe? Or were they stupid? Are we stupid? Maybe they were smarter. Or maybe we're smarter now. Maybe they were careless. But the comparison is really interesting. And it just, before we even kind of get into any libertarian angle here, it's just part of a general theme is skepticism. So, there's some kind of common sense skepticism that comes to bear here. And actually, if you think about this, anyone who's about, 51 or 52 years old or older would have lived through this Hong Kong pandemic. I haven't talked to anyone who really remembers it. So take that for what it's worth. Interesting comparison. Might want to just check out the chat box here for a second. So let me see. Yes, someone asked, are we dissidents now? And I think, yes, we are. I think if you're in the chat box, you are considered a dissident. I think I am considered a dissident as well. So yeah, there are some people in the chat box here who are, I guess, watching this stream who do go to the secret meetings. There's some names I don't recognize. And oh, there's new person, codename new person. Okay, so yeah, the chat box, that's all fun. Let's go back to whatever we were talking about here. So Woodstock comparison again, were they stupid or are we stupid? Again, no evidence that the world lost its mind, as we appear to be losing our mind now. And they are putting us on the hook for some major stuff here. So Trudeau a while back said, well, we can't go back to normal until there's a vaccine, because we don't want people to get sick. But, I mean, first of all, how long does that take? That seems pretty ridiculous. Indefinite martial law, basically. With no knowledge of what the exact conditions are to get out of that. Some vaccine that some crony corporation makes for you, I don't know. Oh, my cat is causing problems too. I wonder if that's going to be an issue. Anyway, so yeah, that's a major thing. But here's the thing. All these people, I have heard this a lot. I have heard this a lot from people. They say, "Oh well, it's no big deal. We just gotta lock down until there's a vaccine, or we gotta be careful till there's a vaccine." Blah blah blah. Okay, this whole coronavirus thing, this is not the coronavirus. As you probably know, coronavirus is a category. It's a large category. It includes all kinds of things, including the common cold. And according to the first paragraph on Wikipedia, there has never been a vaccine for a coronavirus. And what, then all of a sudden Trudeau's buddies are going to come up with a vaccine within a year or something? Come on. Trudeau is screwing with us. All of our politicians are, again, putting us on the hook for a completely unreasonable expectation about this vaccine stuff. There might never be a vaccine for this, and I don't know why we would think there would be. And it doesn't matter if you're like where you are on the vaccine debate. It's just this is a scary thing if this is seriously what politicians are considering imposing upon us. I like this guy. You know, I'm pretty mad lately, but this guy's just trying to live a life as normal as possible. I respect his effort. I think we should all try and be like this guy. And that is the end of the discussion. We're done. That is your life lesson for today. That is, of course, a joke, and probably not a very funny one. But you got to respect this guy. Anyway, I just thought we should freak out before we get further into the presentation. Because here's the cases in Alberta. Now, this is about a week old now. But in the hospital, you'll note, on May 13th, we had 70 people with the virus in the hospital. I mean, that's terrifying. We have 4.4 million people, 70 people in the hospital, and look at that, 11 in intensive care. Oh, and by the way, the 11 in the intensive care is included in the hospitalized number of 70. So total is 70 people in the hospital, and sorry, at face value, there's no reason to freak out over this. There's no reason to think the healthcare capacity is going down. or you know, the healthcare capacity is going to be completely overwhelmed, and the system will fail, and everyone will die. So let's start moving into this lockdown ethical issue a bit here. Maybe before we do that, let's just check the chat box again. Oh yeah, secret meetings in the 80s. That's right. Right on. Okay, so we are going to bring a little bit more of a libertarian angle in here, but let's just start with kind of a common sense critique of some of these so-called arguments around the lockdown or this virus martial law. We can call it a practical critique or a common sense critique. So just a few things here. Just in general, libertarians especially, but most sane people in general know that the government is bad at most things that it tries to do. So in terms of means and ends, it might not be the most efficient way to, say, fight the virus or save lives when it comes to using the government to make that happen. We should always be very skeptical, and the bigger the government program that's being proposed, or the bigger the scale of the solution being proposed, the more skeptical they should be. So instantly we should have our guard up, whoever we are. We also don't want to be suckered in by any kind of false dichotomy about lives versus the economy. Now, this is what a lot of people say, you think money is more important than saving people's lives. You're a terrible person. And, well, that seems like a pretty hard argument to get out of unless you think the economy is life. There's no choice there. Economics is a general theory of all your individual and social action. It is everything that life is, basically. All the actions and choices, anyway. It doesn't tell you what you should do with your life, but it describes causal relationships in any kind of action. So there's no choice here. If someone's saying, again, economy versus lives, it's a fallacy. And of course they'll say like, you want to go watch a hockey game and you don't care if grandma dies. You want grandma to die for your own selfish pleasures. Well, no, that's of course silly, but we do hear this a lot. And it kind of leads into the next thing, which is the idea that if it saves one life, it's worth it. Now, you hear this a lot in life, but in real life, we don't really work this way. The world doesn't work that way, and that might sound like kind of a dad argument or a fatherly reproach, but that's not how things work. So everything in life is kind of a choice at the margin, and safety is like that as well. What I mean by that is everything we do could be made safer if we change the way we do it. But of course, we accept a certain level of normal risk in life, and we say at a certain point, safety isn't as worth it anymore. So, like, think of highway crashes or just motor vehicle collisions that kill thousands of people in Canada every year. I think in the US it's like 30 to 40,000 or something. So if you think about that for a second, we could basically stop every one of those deaths from happening by saying the regulation is no vehicle can go faster than 30 kilometers an hour. There would be very few traffic fatalities, but no one would accept that. Because it would make life essentially intolerable. So, same thing with roofers, for example. Roofers is one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. If you count up, the death rates for it, it could definitely be safer. But when you go to a lot of workers in unsafe professions and you say, well, you could make less money and be safer, or be about the same level of safety and make more. And they will tend to pick money more than that because, again, there's a limit on how much safety you actually want in life before it's not worth it anymore. And the same thing is when we're thinking about safety with regards to this virus thing. If it saves one life, it's worth it. That's not how we make choices in this world. But I believe it was New York Governor Cuomo who said that. I believe he actually said that. If it saves one life, it's worth it. The implications of that are pretty dire, and I don't think it should be a valid point that people can throw at you because it sounds good emotionally. And then there's this safetyism thing, like Brendan O'Neill has talked about this a bit. I don't think the idea comes from him, but it's just interesting as a side point that this is kind of an explosion of a certain idea of safetyism, as it's been called. And you can think in terms of, well, the virus on the one hand, we have to maximize our safety, but it's kind of a facet of a broader point some people have said where safetyism is kind of like on college campuses with the safe spaces, or it's in the idea of ridiculous regulations or impositions to protect yourself from terrorism, for example. It's kind of weird. It seems like we're becoming less and less able to deal with the natural risks of life as time goes on in our age of social democracy. And I think this virus has pretty much come at the worst time for that. And it's never a good argument, of course, that, if something bad might happen, I get to take your rights away. We'll talk about that a little more in a moment, but that's what a lot of intervention ultimately comes down to. It's people worried, again, about, certain risk factors that they prefer to not deal with. And so they say, well, I get to use the government, use the badges and guns to stop you from doing something because something bad might happen. That's a recipe for disaster. I don't think that is a good argument either. But again, that underlies a lot of what this lockdown's about. You got to lose your rights, otherwise someone might get sick. The economists talk about the seen versus the unseen. And if somebody says to you, well, we saved X number of lives, so that's good, isn't it? Well, you say, yes, that is good to save lives. But you have to ask, what else is there? What is the consequence of that? The Economist talks about the seen versus the unseen. You see what's obvious, but what was destroyed in order to do that? So again, there's this big trade-off that people aren't talking about. How many lives are being lost to deal with the lockdown versus the numbers of how many you might be saving? And it comes down to this idea, only free people can save lives. The tyrant or the central planner or the government, they don't save any lives, they're only trading some lives for another. And, they're hoping that the numbers work out in their favor. They'll spin it so that it sounds like that either way. And it's not even really clear what the lockdown argument is because it's morphing. First it was we have to save the healthcare system. Then it kind of started looking more like the healthcare system wasn't going to blow up. But then it's, no, we need to lock down until we can find a vaccine. Again, as I mentioned, that's a very different proposition. And maybe that's not it. It almost seems to be evolving to this really weird point, kind of morphed into that safetyism thing I talked about, where it's like, okay, we need the lockdown until no one ever dies or ever gets sick from COVID. The debate almost seems to be moving that way, and that's actually scary because, again, that's not how life works. Unfortunately, people do get sick and die. It's just a question of what should the government's response be and what is justified and what is effective. We'll get into that some more. There's the question, of course, do the lockdowns work? That is an important question. If you put aside the rights thing and you're just trying to come up with numbers on one side or another, well, don't you want to know if the lockdowns work? Now, there seems to be some scholarly debate as to whether they're actually effective or not. We'll look at that a little bit more later. But before we get into that, I want to raise the basic problem of this sort of utilitarian argument. Like, are you getting enough goodness points with the lockdown? Or are you getting more goodness points overall with the non-lockdown or some, softer response. Well, fundamental issue there is basically it's very hard to add up those goodness points. It's kind of just a fantasy. There's no real scientific way to make that kind of interpersonal utility comparison that would say objectively that this is better than something else. Now, I'm kind of dodging a bigger issue of welfare economics, but that's a simpler way to describe the basic problem, at least for now. Some people have said, oh, this is just like a trolley problem. The fun little ethical quandary that you get posed in the early philosophy classes at university. And central planners and people with this messiah complex, they just drool over this because they want to be the one making the decision. But the idea is, okay, look, trolley's rolling down, you've got a choice to hit the switch, and you're going to kill either one group of people on one side of the tracks, or the other set of tracks, you're going to kill that guy. But this isn't actually applicable to what the government's doing right now, because the trolley problem, the guy knows exactly how many people he's going to save on each side. It's just a question of whether he should intervene or not, basically, based on that knowledge. Here, the government has the switch, but they don't know the correct number, or the highest number of people to be saved on one side of the tracks or another. So it's a bad dilemma. You shouldn't think about it this way either, although it's been brought up a lot in this context. Now, before we get into the actual rather simple libertarian argument against the lockdown, I'm going to check the chat box again. So let's see. Nothing really happening in the chat box. We have a few viewers though. Okay, well, let's get back to this. Here we have smiling Murray Rothbard offering his wisdom to us. Hang on. Actually, before we do that, I do have a shot of whiskey here. There we go. Okay. What does pardon me. Obviously, we're amateurs around here. What would Murray Rothbard, the Mr. Libertarian himself, say about the lockdown? Well, it would come down to basic principles at first. So, he says, no one may threaten or commit violence, aggress against another man's person or property. Violence may be employed only against the man who commits such violence. That is, only defensively against the aggressive violence of another. In short, no violence may be employed against a non-aggressor. So in other words, violence in self-defense, that's okay. To initiate violence against someone, not good. Very simple. Most people can intuitively accept that, even if they might not accept all the libertarian conclusions. But wait, think about that for a second. If I can use violence in self-defense, doesn't that justify the quarantine? Because don't I need the badges and the guns and the violence to defend myself against the aggressor who has the virus, and they're going to make me sick, and I'm going to die, and then I'm going to my property rights are violated, or I'm oppressed, or my liberty is affected. So, did we just create a libertarian argument for the quarantine? Well, no. No, we didn't. It's a little more tricky than that. So Rothbard says it is important to insist, however, that the threat of aggression be palpable, immediate, and direct. In short, that it be embodied in the initiation of an overt act. Any remote or indirect criterion, any risk or threat, is simply an excuse for invasive action by the supposed defender against the alleged threat. So, a guy running at you with an axe is a palpable, immediate, and direct threat. Might be reasonable to use self-defense against that person. But to say, well, I can use violence against this guy over here because someday, somewhere, and somehow he might attack me. That's actually more appropriate as a comparison to the virus panic. So virus people are not zombies from Resident Evil or Dawn of the Dead or anything. They do not turn into flesh-eating monsters with no will, who can't help but hurt you or aggress against you. They're just regular people who are sick, and they might get you sick. So people are not threatening you with immediate pain and death, like somebody charging with an axe, or someone plotting to murder you, or someone with a gun in your face telling you to hand over your stuff. That is not what the virus is, and what would normally justify violence and self-defense, or again, bringing the badges and guns to bear. If you have the disease, you might pass it on to others. That is true. If you come in contact with them or interact with them in certain ways, you could spread the disease or the virus. But on the other hand, you might not. And even if you do, which you might not, they might not get sick. They might, if you pass it to them. But that's a weak justification, again, to use violence, which all of the state's laws, all of its public health orders ultimately depend on, again, badges and guns, violence, the force of the state to enforce. If you didn't have the state, you wouldn't have the right to use violence against someone who you thought might be sick, or healthy for that matter, because that's one of the crazy things about this lockdown. So, okay, thinking like a regular Joe on the street for a second, quarantine seems most appropriate, not for healthy people, but for sick people, or maybe in certain extreme cases like a district or a small area that's just overrun with disease and death. It's a pretty major thing to me that they're actually pointing the law of the state and threatening them when they're healthy. Like, don't go outside, don't go do this, don't stand too close to somebody, don't run your restaurant business, etc., etc. It's just crazy. So Rothbard elaborates here. Once one can use force against someone because of his risky activities, the sky is the limit, and there is virtually no limit to the aggression against the rights of others. Once we permit someone's fear of the risky activities of others to lead to coercive action, then any tyranny becomes justified. And it's absolutely correct. Again, you might do something bad to me someday. I have no evidence that that could be the case, but it might happen. So I need to use violence against you. I need to regulate you. I need to expropriate your property. I need to interfere with your liberty, basically, without proper ethical justification. Just because I'm scared or because it's risky, it's scary. You can apply that to anyone. Oh, a certain group of people, they're more likely to be a murderer. So, we should punish them in advance. Or this country might attack me someday. I'd better bomb them and destroy their cities. Libertarian ethics doesn't work that way. And I think it's simple and a pretty legitimate way to think about the ethical problem of the lockdown. Now, bringing that kind of into real life, this is just Wisconsin, which is just one state in North America, or one state in the United States. But I just thought it was interesting how some of these ideas can kind of translate into a real life case. And there's been a number of court cases where lockdown orders have been knocked down by judges or the court system. Wisconsin had an interesting one kind of recently, and I just wanted to quote a little bit of it, just out of interest, really quickly. So under Palm's theory, and Palm is the government official or the governor or whatever, under Palm's theory, she can implement all emergency measures necessary to control communicable diseases, even at the expense of fundamental liberties without rulemaking. And that's basically how all of the bureaucrats and the politicians are acting right now. Like, extreme situation, we got to do all this crazy stuff, even if it interferes with your liberties. But the Wisconsin Supreme Court takes this kind of standard argument and says, well, it's constitutionally suspect. And constitutionally, you can think of in this term as, well, no, it doesn't necessarily override your main rights that are supposed to be protected. So they say when a grant of legislative power is made, there must be a procedural safeguard to prevent the arbitrary, unreasonable, or oppressive conduct of the agency. Palm cannot point to any procedural safeguards on the power she claims, so she's just able to do whatever she wants, basically. Palm's argument about being able to fine and imprison those who break her orders without legal foundation ignores more than 50 years of Wisconsin law. Order 28 exceeds the statutory authority to quarantine those infected or suspected of being infected. This directive is not based on persons infected or suspected of being infected, as the United States Department of Justice has recently written in a COVID-19 related case raising constitutional issues. There is no pandemic exclusion to the fundamental liberties in the Constitution. So again, just an interesting, curious, real-life example of the idea that just because there's a public health risk, your fundamental liberties don't go away. And I'm no lawyer, but I'm pretty sure that's true for Canada. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms is still the law of the land. So I think a lot of this stuff, if challenged, would collapse even in questionable courts. But that's an issue for another day. Moving on. So our friend Mike correctly points out overreaction helps elites consolidate power. And it's good timing that I looked over and saw that, because that's kind of what we're going to talk about now. I'm just going to have a swig of water. Pretty good. I like the sports cap. I think that's a very efficient way to drink your water. Moving on. The state loves a crisis, doesn't it? So this is a crisis, mostly of the state's own making, but of course the state then swoops in with all these emergency powers, says they're going to save us, and we kind of go along with it. We're seeing it now. There's a well-known quote that's often brought up by the former Obama chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel. He said, "You never let a serious crisis go to waste." And what I mean by that, it's an opportunity to do things that you think you could not do before. Now, this is just a guy talking. But one of the great classics of, I guess you could say, the libertarian bibliography is Crisis and Leviathan by Robert Higgs. Robert Higgs, I believe, has a PhD in economics, but I believe most of his published work was economic history. Anyway, the main idea of Crisis and Leviathan is that the state's power grows during periods of crisis. And it's a great book, very worth reading, but it goes through some series of crises that happen in American history and shows how, in responding to these, the state's power grows more or less permanently in most respects. So the libertarian always has to fear the crisis, because that's when the government's power grows the most quickly with the least resistance that might normally have been brought to bear against it. Because people are scared, they'll go along with things. Look at Trudeau's approval rating. People love Trudeau right now, at least relatively. He's considered a leader in a scary time. Same thing, think about George Bush. Not a very popular president, but his approval went up a lot after 9/11. It's just kind of the way it works a lot of the times. Robert Higgs, the writer, under discussion, he says, each time the government expands its effective authority over economic decision-making, it sets in motion a variety of economic, institutional, and ideological adjustments whose common denominator is a diminished resistance to bigger government. Every time the crisis rolls in, the aftermath happens when the system has become deformed. People's ideas have become deformed, and they've changed and corrupted, if you will. And they now accept some of these emergency interferences with liberty and justice that, again, wouldn't have been accepted before. But the crisis changes people. Now, a funny way to think about this, I don't know if people remember this guy, but this is the shoe bomber guy. And, you know, a few years after 9/11, it was one of the screwball little terrorist incidents. This guy tried to get on a plane with a bomb in his shoe, and the bomb didn't even work, if I remember correctly. But it was just one guy. It wasn't a successful attack. It's kind of a stupid idea, really. But anyway, ever since this, you know, we've had to take our shoes off at the airport, and people just accepted it. People never had to do that before. And it's just one way to illustrate what we're talking about here. People get used to things. And unfortunately, it just so happens that people get used to having their liberties kind of stepped on or choked out a bit. James Buchanan from the Public Choice School talks about this idea as well. He says, experience suggests that almost universally, tax and public spending rates, which are increased temporarily to meet wartime or other emergency fiscal needs, remain substantially higher in post-war, post-emergency periods than before. Wartime spending needs are such that the threshold of the decision can be crossed with newly imposed taxes or with substantial increases in rate levels of existing taxes. The additional real costs in opportunity cost terms of the expanded spending program is accepted in the emergency setting. Once these needs disappear, in other words, once the emergency goes away, James Buchanan says, did I say James Madison at first, like the president? No, this is the political economist. So once the emergency disappears, he says, the bias is shifted in favor of a continued high level of public activity as opposed to a return to some pre-emergency balance between the public and private sector. Not having to undergo the apparent sacrifice of real resources generated by new tax financing. The individual is more willing in post-emergency periods to approve spending on the provision of services than he would have been in the pre-emergency setting. Translated from kind of boring academic talk, after the emergency, more of your liberty is gone. More of your money is gone. Your productive, or the resources you produce, more of that needs to be taken. Needs to be sucked up by the state. Oh, the emergency's gone? Oh, don't worry about that. We still need it. And you're going to like it. So, those are some libertarian concerns. Now, the more utilitarian or cost-benefit oriented person is going to say, well, I get it. I get the rights argument. Liberty's cool and all that. But what if we're all going to die? What if there will be so many dead people that liberty is just unacceptable in this situation? Well, I'm not really convinced that's ever true, but let's say maybe it is true. Let's just play along for a bit. So the question is, very important here, how deadly is this virus? Very, very important, because if it's not that deadly, well, then it's just kind of a non-issue. If it's extremely deadly, well, then maybe we can have that discussion about the tougher trade-offs in that kind of crazy situation. So before we kind of tackle the question of, kind of how deadly is it? Is the world ending if we don't take these emergency actions? I'm just going to look at the chat box again. Let's see. Interesting comment from one of our viewers here, who says no sitting president has lost an election during a war, in regards to how people rally around their leaders when they're scared or when something bad is happening. And I think that might actually be true. I think that's why maybe presidents like wars. There was a movie about all that, like the old funny Wag the Dog movie. Using a war to kind of help your political situation. I mean, it happens. let's talk about the virus here. So I'm not a scientist, obviously. I'm just some idiot on the internet. I don't... you don't necessarily have to trust me, but I have some questions here that I don't think are very well addressed. And I think there are a lot of scientists who kind of support where my intuition leads. So bear with me for a bit. So I want to start with kind of like cowboy math, or again, intuition about how deadly this is. So we basically have two propositions about the virus that are really important. The first is that it's very contagious. Okay. The second is that it's very deadly. So these are two propositions. And let me point out that both of these might be true, or maybe only one or the other is true, or maybe neither of them are true. I don't know. I'm stupid. I just want to lay it out this way. Obviously, the worst virus is the one that's very contagious and very deadly. The best virus would be one that's not very contagious and not very deadly. So another interesting thing that we seem to have fairly reliable data on is that the virus came to North America at some point in middle of January. And we also know that for a long time, people didn't really care. Like, it wasn't considered a big deal. A lot of the bureaucrats who are now total lockdown fanatics were pretty casual about the whole thing. And there was not really any big, major, widespread locking down for the most part until about mid-March. So let's say there's about 2 months of a virus in North America spreading. So again, as a stupid person, my question would be, well, if it's true that the virus is very contagious and very deadly, and it's been around for 2 months and people didn't really do anything about it, where are the mountains of corpses? Shouldn't there have been some dramatic end times level stuff? And we didn't really see that. Now, that doesn't mean that much on its own, but it's something to think about, because to me that suggests one of those two propositions must be wrong. It could be very contagious, but maybe it's not very deadly. Or it could be very deadly, but maybe it's not very contagious. It seems to be, just from my basic observation, that if it was very contagious and very deadly, it would have been very much uglier in the US and Canada than it is, because it's, it's a semi-big problem in some areas. So I think only one of these propositions can be true, and I think it's more likely the first one than the second one. So when we think about how deadly something is, a lot of the number that gets kind of tossed around casually is just the number of deaths over the number of confirmed cases. And, that tells you something, but the problem when you're kind of doing this in the midst of everything happening is you don't really have a proper figure for that denominator. You have the number of confirmed cases. You don't have the actual number of cases, which would be all the people who died of the virus and all the people who had the virus and recovered from it. That would be your actual number of cases, which would, if you had the actual number of deaths, let you get the proper death rate. But of course, deaths over confirmed cases are going to lead to a much higher death rate than this bottom one, death over deaths and recovered. One thing we don't hear much about is the actual number of cases. But there was a Stanford study. There's been more of this happening as testing has been widespread. But one of the clearest examples that kind of starts supporting this intuition we're talking about, that maybe it's very contagious but not very deadly. Again, Stanford study, they did random testing in Santa Clara County in California. And what they found was that between 2.49 to 4.16% of people in Santa Clara County had been infected with COVID-19 by April 1st. This was representing 48,000 to 81,000 people, but The county officials had only recorded 956 confirmed cases by that point, so the Stanford study estimated that the actual number of cases was between 50 and 85 times what the county officials said it was in the official numbers. Now, of course, just simple cowboy math. If that's true, then of course the death rate must be very, very low, given the number of deaths divided by the actual number of cases, or at least a reasonable estimate for it. The plot thickens, and you think, well, that's just Santa Clara County, whatever, it doesn't mean anything. But we're seeing this more and more and more. The more the testing becomes widespread, this seems to be the general pattern. I'll just bring up Canada here itself for the moment. The article I pulled up, they kept updating and the headline kept changing, so it doesn't seem relevant, but the part that you care about is Theresa Tam said 740,000 tests have been carried out across Canada so far, with about 20,000 people getting tested daily. 7% have tested positive. So that's quite a lot. Again, 740,000 tests, 7% positive. So again, just cowboy math to support this intuition or not. Say we've got 37 million Canadians, and assume that it's not even a 7% positive, but say it's just half, 3.5% positive. Well, then you're talking about roughly 1.295 million estimated cases in the entire country. And out of, at the time this number's taken, 2,700 deaths, you're talking about a death rate that's basically the same as what we get with influenza season. And we don't shut down society for the flu. So we seem to have some good reasons to be suspicious about the numbers. You see this kind of in Germany and some of the other places, again, where they're doing more widespread testing. It's kind of in the 3 to 6% positive rate. And of course, they say many people are asymptomatic, or they get symptoms so minor they don't really notice. Now, I learned that there's some people who can go their whole life without ever getting the flu. But I also learned that there's a lot of people that basically never get, they get the flu, or they get sick, or they get infected, I should say, but they don't get sick, or their sickness is so minor it's not really attributed to anything serious. And apparently that's the case with a lot of people with the Wuhan virus. It doesn't affect them. It affects them to a relatively minor degree, or they get sick for a few weeks and then they live. It does affect certain people very seriously, but that's not unusual for a kind of sickness like that. So, again, getting to the point of like, well, why are we locking down the whole society? The overwhelming majority of people do not have any significant risk of dying from the Wuhan virus. That's just how it is. We're going to look at New York here specifically because it's, everyone keeps saying, oh, you're going to become New York if you don't lock yourself down. Now, New York represents 1/3 of all U.S. deaths. The death rate there for 18 to 45 years old is 0.01%, or 10 per 100,000 of the population. On the other hand, people 75 and older have a death rate 80 times that. For people under 18 years old, the death rate is 0 per 100,000. So it's a very different risk profile depending on who you are. 2/3 of all fatal cases were in patients over 70 years of age, mostly seniors. 95% were over 50 years of age. About 90% of all fatal cases had an underlying illness. So, of 6,500 confirmed COVID-19 deaths fully investigated for underlying conditions to date, 6,570 of those, 6,520, all but 50, or 99.2%, had an underlying illness. if you do not already have an underlying chronic conditions, your chance of dying are pretty small, regardless of your age. But again, this kind of undermines this extreme deadliness version. It seems to affect some people very badly, but for the most part, you're probably going to be fine. Young adults and children in normal health have almost no risk of any serious illness. So, that is something to think about. And we can look at the Canadian numbers. So the blue bars are probably the most interesting because those are the deaths. And you can see as you move down the x-axis, you get to the older age groups. And of course, the oldest age groups are dying a lot. And from 39 down to zero years old, it's basically a non-issue. It's kind of just normal part of life, like the flu again. Surely sucks if you get it, but you won't die, and a lot of people won't even be too inconvenienced, and they'll be asymptomatic entirely. And of course, I'm just going to throw this in here again as kind of a sidebar thing, but there's some question about how they count some of this stuff. Now, there's an interesting comparison if you take all the heart disease, cancer, accidents, strokes, Alzheimer's, flu, homicide deaths from last year at this time and compare them with the same deaths plus the COVID deaths. It seems like a lot of the COVID deaths are eating the other deaths. And I'm not saying there's any kind of scandal in the way they count the deaths, but maybe there's some kind of scandal in the way they count the deaths. And a lot of people that would have died anyway. COVID just sped things up a little bit. I don't want to sound crass, but that might just be how it is for some people. This is exactly what you see in Italy. Now, this is an excerpt from a report that's provided to the Ministry of Health. And you can see basically it lists all the cases that had pre-morbidity or comorbidities with the COVID deaths. What you see at the bottom is only 1.2% of the attributed COVID deaths had nothing else wrong with them. All the others, basically, almost all of them had at least one problem, and almost half of them had at least 3 other serious problems. So, again, serious risk to some people. Maybe we need to take special effort to protect certain groups without locking everyone down and putting the boot on the throat of everyone who wants to go outside or live a normal life. So here's an advisor to the Italian Minister of Health talking about this kind of same idea. Not everyone is affected the same, and maybe the death numbers are kind of weird the way they're counting them. You know, who do you believe? But anyway, this guy says the age of our patients in hospitals is substantially older. The median is 67, while in China it was 46. So essentially the age distribution of our patients is squeezed to an older age, and there's substantial, and this is substantial in increasing the lethality. Again, we were told so many times, like, oh, you're going to become Italy unless you have this crazy lockdown. But there's different kinds of conditions that can make it a bigger problem than it otherwise would be, especially with the whole Italian situation here. And excerpts from the report, like, a lot of these people are just plain sick, and unfortunately this virus comes along and kind of pushes them over the edge. But that's something interesting to know about when you're thinking about these kinds of decisions, especially when you're thinking, oh, does it overwhelm the healthcare system or not? Because a lot of the people who have 3 comorbidities, which is 50% almost of the COVID deaths, a lot of them are going to be dead within a year anyway because of one of those other comorbidities. So they were probably going to be hospitalized just at a different point in time. And they're not really representing a new strain on the system, just the strain they create might happen at a different moment. Continuing on, what does Dr. Ricciardi say? He also said the way in which we code deaths in our country is very generous in the sense that all people who die in hospitals with the coronavirus are deemed to be dying of the coronavirus. But, of course, there's a distinction to be made there, dying of or dying with. He says on reevaluation by the National Institute of Health, only 12% of death certificates have shown a direct causality from coronavirus, while 88% of patients who have died have had at least one premorbidity, and many had 2 or 3. Again, why do we have to protect everyone from themselves when at most we should be making some special care to protect certain vulnerable groups who are already sick or very old? Now, people have been looking at Sweden like, oh, well, if you don't have the lockdown, you're going to all die. And of course, Sweden has been very interesting to watch, no matter where you are on the debate, because we've wanted to see, with their rather limited lockdown, because you can still have groups 50 or under, kids still go to school and go to their soccer games and stuff. You can still go to the restaurants and the bars. For the most part, life seems pretty normal in Sweden, although obviously there's a lot of social adjustments that people make when they think they're all sick or other people might be sick, but very different legal and policy response. Anyway, a lot of these virus fanatics have been watching Sweden like, oh, just wait. Everyone in Sweden is going to die, and then you anti-lockdown people are going to feel really stupid. So we've been watching Sweden. What is going to happen in Sweden? Well, what did the models say would happen in Sweden? So one model from Swedish epidemiologists predicted this kind of curve with, like, you know, you got your worst case scenario and then a medium case and then a lower case. And it's still pretty bad. Like, it predicts 5,000 hospitalizations at the peak of the lowest prediction. There was another study that was even worse with a much more deadly worst case scenario, and of course a deadlier base scenario and a deadliest best case scenario. So how are things looking? Well, there's the actual information after the public health bureaucracy was like, it might not happen. So they planned for 1,700 admissions over the virus. And you can see in the chart there, like, the line doesn't even come close to what we saw in these other ones. It's nowhere close 5,000. It's not even cracking 1,000 hospitalizations. And again, they don't have much of a lockdown. Like, where is the crazy spike of death and disease? I don't know. Maybe we'll see it someday. I don't think so, though. So the Imperial College, who their model is basically what led to the whole world freaking out, in my opinion. But they modeled what would happen for Sweden based on the model that, again, they freaked everyone out with. You can see the do nothing case and the moderate lockdown kind of case. And then the actual case, the red. It's pretty bumpy, but it doesn't look like it's going to turn into anything like what the so-called experts have predicted. Let's look at Alberta for a second. Here, this is from the latest updated model as of April 28th, 2020. And this was after adjusting their models downwards to reduce the projected severity of the disease. You can see this baseline, or not the baseline, the best case scenario line, which is the lowest curve. It predicted, as of today, what's the 19th? So basically we would have had about 300 hospitalizations. Well, as of the 13th, I showed you here at the beginning. This was as of the 13th, it's 70 people in the hospital. And I remember the press conference the next day, the 14th, so on Friday, the hospitalizations was down to 65. So the models are way wrong. They might have over-predicted the dangerousness to justify some of these interventions. And then you wonder, well, does the lockdown work at all? So some folks put together some data for the Wall Street Journal. And they took all these countries with different approaches to the lockdown. Basically, the deaths versus the time to the shutdown. And was there a difference in the death rates or basically the number of deaths per million, depending on whether they lock down sooner or later. And basically they found nothing. They found no correlation. 5.5% is basically nothing. In the social sciences, that is garbage. You look for other factors. And of course, other things could be a very major factor in some places. Like you think population density might be an issue. Subway use might be an issue. New York City with its nasty ass subway. When they looked at the correlation for deaths to population density, of course, they found a 44% correlation, which is a very strong connection. Much more so than whether the lockdown works or not. There's also that guy out of the University of Tel Aviv. He was saying when he looked at the charts of, I think, 7 or 8 different countries, and he found that it looks like whether you lock down or not, the shape of the curve of the rise in infections and eventual fall, it looks more or less the same regardless of the lockdown. You can look that up, Professor Isaac Ben Israel's theory, and it seemed that it might be true, but the data doesn't seem to support the lockdowns in any case. Quick pause here. I'm going to check the chat room for a sec, see what people are saying. Okay, someone says, yes, there is some analysis suggesting the virus has been in North America since last October or earlier. Now, I don't know if that's true, but I've read that as well, and I think it might be true. I just don't know. But if that's true, it makes the skepticism about the deadliness of the virus even more justified, because, again, it seems that it's very contagious, and if it's very deadly, and it's spreading around since October with basically no one changing their life or interactions at all for the sake of the virus issue, it should have been spreading like crazy. Where is the Mount Everest size of corpses in North America if that's true? Yes, someone else says the average age of people who died of the virus in Alberta is 82. Yes, basically all the deaths have been in long-term care homes, which I'm no expert. I don't know how you deal with that kind of situation, but again, the risk is very concentrated for certain groups of people, and that doesn't justify taking away the rights of other people. Yeah, I've talked to a few people, and there's some comments about this in the little chat there, about how they felt like they got the Wuhan virus before the panic started. And that seems to be true, especially because it's a nasty respiratory issue for a lot of people. And let's see. I know some people think the virus is like, oh, it's a hoax. It's a hoax. Do you know anyone who's had the virus? And I think I know some people who've had the virus. I don't think it's a hoax, but the people who I know who say they had it, they say they think they had it in January or February. A few economic comments in the chat box. I'm going to come to that in a little bit. I think we're almost there, actually. So let's just power through a few more slides. Actually, quick swig of water. And let's have another... Let's get angry. It's the angry live stream. Let's have some more whiskey. Total degeneracy. Okay. Let's continue. Okay, so nothing is worse than a government expert on a power trip, and they are way worse for your health than any virus ever has been. I want to talk about the problems with government experts a little bit, and I want to focus on Professor Lockdown himself, as the UK media calls him, Neil Ferguson at Imperial College. They call him Professor Lockdown because he was really the reason the public debate transformed from kind of a laissez-faire sort of, nothing much to worry about, to, oh my god. The reason is the Imperial College published a 20-page report on March 16th forecasting that an uncontrolled spread of COVID-19 could cause as many as 510,000 deaths in Britain and as many as 2.2 million deaths in the United States. Now, those are crazy numbers when you stop and think about them. That is huge. And I'm not saying even if those numbers are true, it invalidates the rights argument, but that's a pretty major public health catastrophe, and a lot of people were scared in the government level, and then the media propagated these scary numbers and kind of got the mob all riled up as well. But this is the guy. He has caused maybe more damage to the world economy than any individual person in history. Now, this is a guy. Why would you believe him? Well, he's like, he's got one of the top jobs in epidemiology in the UK. He must be smart. But this guy has a terrible track record. He's basically been wrong every time there's been a big public health scare in the last 20 years. Whether it was because of foot and mouth disease epidemic, or whether it was because of mad cow disease, his panic over that. He was totally wrong about the bird flu with his crappy models, and he was totally wrong about the swine flu with his crappy models. And, a guy being wrong shouldn't be a big deal, but when the government puts so much weight on his opinion, and the public discourse or the culture of the people looks to experts like this priestly class who are beyond reproach and beyond questioning, it's so dangerous. The government makes a mistake not just for itself, but it affects everyone, whereas you make a mistake for you, mostly just affects you and maybe the small social circle around you. Government experts are bad. And of course, it's trust the experts. Which experts? Do you trust the government experts or do you trust other experts? There's a lot of people who have challenged the lockdown panic justification, the virus models from very early on. And not cranks and weirdos or people with blogs on the internet, like Nobel Prize winning Stanford professors and people with as much credibility at face value in terms of credentials as the people we're supposed to listen to and take their word as gospel. Oh, we have a cat joining us for presentation. Hey, kitty. Kitty. Right on. Okay. Problem of experts. So, one thing that will never lead you wrong in your life, whether you're a libertarian or not, is Rockwell's Law. Rockwell's Law is basically just, if the government says something, believe the opposite, unless you have very strong evidence to the contrary. And it's pretty helpful in life, actually. That's what I've been kind of operating on for this virus. And in my days of hypotheticals and confusion, I wasn't so sure, but as the data came in, it seemed skepticism has been warranted. But why is Rockwell's Law kind of useful? Well, it's because, as Hayek wrote in The Road to Serfdom, the basic problem of social democracy is that the worst are going to rise to the top. The system rewards the worst people because the worst people are the best at wielding power and influencing decision making, not helping people. You don't become the top political person in a country because you're the nicest guy or you're the most just person. You get there because you're kind of a bad person. You like manipulating people and you like wielding power. And there's no reason to think that meritocracy operates in the government. It's almost impossible to fire people. It's based on political alliances and decision making as to who rises to the top, more so than your individual competence. I think we have a lot of general support for that idea in our lives, that the government is full of the worst people, not people who should have that much weight put on their decisions. Now, the problem with, of course, centralization, again, like I said, error, If a small jurisdiction makes a mistake, it affects the small jurisdiction. But if you centralize the decision making and they get it wrong, well, then it affects everyone. It makes it actually harder to kind of twist your way out of the problem than it would be with decentralization, a little more favor towards different kinds of experts, and debate, like open debate about it. Another important thing is, regardless of who the experts are and how good their information is, they don't replace value judgments, or information does not create a value judgment on its own. They can describe a technical relationship or a cause and effect relationship, but that doesn't tell you what you should do, and that comes down to an ethical argument. Experts aren't on the stage making ethical arguments. They're mostly giving us bad data and shoving their crappy solutions down our throats. But on the utilitarian issue, it's, if we still want to trust the experts, think they've got our best interests at heart, what do? Well, then we just look at the flip side of the lockdown. How many people are they killing? Well, we know they're killing a lot. We know the healthcare system's pretty much empty in a lot of the country because no one will go, and they're holding off symptoms, they're delaying surgeries. That has serious consequences. That will kill people. We know that's happening. There is a lot of social science data about the connection between suicide and drug abuse when it comes to job loss and unemployment. We also think a lot about numbers when it's economic stuff or market stuff, financial stuff. Numbers are going up and down, but it's all human lives. And when you destroy that much productivity and destroy that much exchange and trade and human possibility for flourishing, it literally does equal death for some people. And of course, the richer you are, the more likely you are to be able to survive with no income or productivity for months at a time. For poor people, that's really not possible. And so there's an interesting issue where sometimes the ones who say they're looking out for the needy are actually hurting the needy the most. Some people in the chat, or myself here, maybe we're still working, or maybe if we lost our job, we can survive X number of months and it's no big deal. But a lot of people don't have that luxury, especially the poorest people on the planet. But definitely, the farther you tend to move down the income scale, the harder this lockdown is on people. And of course, the stress, the insanity-inducing stupidity of the world does affect your body. I found this interesting chart, all the things that get affected in your body when you got stress. It's pretty bad. It can kill you. Stress will kill you. So let's talk about the economic consequences of the lockdown now. So this is serious. You've heard people talk about, this is basically the biggest crash since the Great Recession, or the biggest economic contraction. That's really what it is. Again, it's not numbers. It's services not being performed. It's goods not being produced. It's exchanges not happening that would otherwise be happening. And all of that leads to impoverishment. You can't just make that go away and have no consequences. It's very serious. Think about, a third of your annual income disappearing or something, like if you're a business or someone who's wiped out of employment. This is serious hardship for people. Then we get to the crazy, absolutely crazy spending that's going on. Whether you're looking at Canada or the US or wherever, there's a lot of crazy emergency measures that are costing a lot of money, and nothing is being cut to compensate. So it's just all being racked up with these massive public debt increases. Now, the consequences of this are pretty major. First of all, a little better probably to have your debt financed by creditors rather than additional taxation, because I don't have a choice whether I pay taxation or not, but I don't have to lend the government money, even though them borrowing money in general creates negative consequences for me and society in general. But I would rather have my taxes remain where they were than be opposed to, pension funds and central banks buying up other government debt. The ones who are mostly going to pay for these debts, I believe, are not the taxpayers, although it affects them differently, indirectly. And when it affects the taxpayers, it's not about, oh, my grandkids are going to have to pay for my bills, or the government's putting today's consumption on our grandkids. It's not the future that has to pay. One thing that's poorly understood about the whole public debt issue is that it hurts the economy right now. That is all capital that would otherwise be spent somewhere else. And that capital is going to be desperately needed in the private sector in order to create any possibility of an economic recovery. But the government is sucking up so much of it for these emergency measures, of course, a lot of which will never go away. So the permanent size of the government will likely get bigger as a result. But it's going to hurt us now. Again, that capital that would otherwise create possibility for economic activity in the private sector, it's going to be absorbed into the government and basically wasted. That's what the economists talk about when, or what they mean when they talk about crowding out private investment. The investors are either buying up private investments or they're buying up public debt investments. We don't want the government to spend more money. We don't want the capital allocated to them. But that's what happens when they spend too much. Now, of course, there's going to be mass unemployment for a while. And they're expanding the welfare class substantially. They're dishing out more bennies. I'm sure people have heard a lot of stories of people who are getting paid more on bennies than they would be working, especially in kind of the lower income categories. A lot of whom are essential workers, by the way. So-called essential workers. I never actually brought that up before, but I can't stand when the government says some people are non-essential. That's twisted. But yes, we are creating a much bigger welfare class. I was going to say, I know of people who quit their job to get the bennies. And I know a lot of people who know people like that. So it's definitely a thing that's happening. And why wouldn't it? You offer a whole bunch of money to not work, or maybe you can make a little bit more, or sometimes even a little bit less if you do work. It's a no-brainer. The welfarism is very attractive for certain kinds of people. Stagflation could be a consequence of all this. Stagflation should be theoretically impossible under Keynesian economics, but the 70s proved that it was a possibility, and we know why it happens. And it's basically when you have inflation and high unemployment at the exact same time. Traditional Keynesian economics teaches that that's kind of a lever that you can play with to get the right results. And you can't have both high unemployment and high inflation at once. But because of the massive degree of spending, a lot of which will be monetized by central banks, and because a lot of it's going directly to specific channels in the economy, there could be some serious inflationary effects, which we haven't seen since the last big inflationary push, which was in the last crisis, when the Federal Reserve and all these other central banks made all this new money. But it didn't turn into major consumer price inflation. It mostly flooded into other assets. Anyway, kind of complicated issue. We'll get into that slightly more. But there's another thing. Totalitarian regulation. Like, how bad is it going to be to actually go somewhere and have a tolerable visit or a tolerable experience in a retail environment? I went to the mall the day it opened on, what was it, May 14th last week. And I'd say about 80% of the stores were still closed. And the ones that were open looked like a huge pain in the ass to go into because they had all these rules, and some guy at the entrance like gives you this speech on how it works and how they're keeping people safe. And it just seems annoying. Like, who wants to deal with that? Can they make going to restaurants so miserable that no one wants to go? Can they make going shopping so miserable that no one wants to go? And then also, like, every little thing you do is subject to more annoying regulation, more hassling from bylaw officers and things. It all of this adds up and suppresses economic activity. That's just how it is. And the danger, of course, is not that, you know, you have a harsh, nasty crash and then you recover quickly. That would be the best case scenario. But government is generally counterproductive to the recovery, and that's why a laissez-faire policy is so important. And that's why the Great Depression lasted so long, because previous economic crashes tended to be over relatively quickly. The Great Depression essentially lasted until the end of World War II, and the consumer was extremely depressed for all that time because of government intervention, made it basically impossible for real economic activity to start happening again for a very long time. And I fear that that might be the case with what's going on with the virus panic. Dear God. University of Chicago, some professors put out a study with some models predicting we find 3 new hires for every 10 layoffs caused by the shock, and estimate that 42% of recent layoffs will result in permanent job loss. So that basically means about 4 out of every 10 jobs won't come back when the lockdown lifts. A lot of restaurants will not open. A lot of stores will not open. A lot of places run on such a tight cash flow basis that the businesses can't last multiple months without opening. And, you know, their creditors want their money. Their landlords want their money. No one gets a free lunch here. So a lot of places just cannot survive not being open. And that's going to create a huge disaster and unnecessary loss of economic activity going forward. A few fun charts to show the depth of the problem. Here's the employment level in the United States. And you can see in the far right corner here, we have a massive, massive collapse in the employment level, which is unprecedented going back to basically 1945. And this wasn't like normal government boom and bust kind of thing. This is basically the government just hitting a switch and saying, you're not essential, don't work. And then on the other hand, you've got the, well, everyone needs to be so scared that don't do anything. But unprecedented and definitely a scary indication of what we're dealing with. Moving on. Here's Treasury issuance. Oh, the title's cut off here. So what this is, well, U.S. Treasury issuance. So basically the deficit, or the amount of money that the Treasury is selling as debt to creditors year over year in the United States. Now, we talk about the empire of debt. The day of reckoning will come soon. And while they've been doing okay with these massive deficits for many years, but to put it in perspective, look at what they're looking at in 2020 for the amount of new debt that needs to be sold, either to the Federal Reserve with new money, or to, you know, big pension funds and other big institutional investors for the most part. That is a crazy amount of money, again, that should be available for the private economy to recover. Instead, it's going to get sucked up. And this is just the American government. But that's many years worth of previous deficits all at once. It's going to be very suffocating for economic growth going forward. Then the Federal Reserve. So, this is the Federal Reserve's assets. And just as a simple way to think about this, when the Federal Reserve buys an asset, which is usually like a treasury bill or something like that, or a treasury bond, U.S. public debt or government debt, basically, they create new money. So whenever this line is going up, that's basically new money being created as they buy new assets. That's monetizing the debt. This chart goes back far enough that you can see the different stages of quantitative easing that happened in the aftermath of the financial crash of 2008. And these were massive, massive increases in the monetary base by the Federal Reserve. You can see with the crisis that's happening now in 2020, a massive, massive increase in monetizing assets. So they've gone from a little over 4 trillion and they're quickly approaching 7 trillion in, so, you know, almost 3 trillion in new created money. And again, there's got to be a day of reckoning here. This is going to create a huge problem at some point when this needs to be unwound. And you can see for the last several years when they haven't been adding assets from this kind of 2014 period to more recently when they kept it stable, or they even started selling off assets. In other words, deflating temporarily after these huge increases in the monetary base. But what's happening now is they've, of course, had to completely reverse that unwinding, and now they're trying to suck up another crisis and buy up every piece of junk asset, whether it's mortgage-backed securities, government debt, municipal bonds, who knows what it all is, but they're buying everything. And it's to prop up the market, prop up investors, prop up Wall Street, prop up big banks, prop up pension funds, etc., to protect against total massive liquidation on a massive scale. But this is going to be a huge problem. One of the reasons quantitative easing 1, 2, and 3 never created hyperinflation, as some people predicted, is because the Federal Reserve now pays interest on the excess reserves of commercial banks. So basically, instead of the Fed creating the money, the big banks getting it, and then through the fractional reserve process, spreading that out through the private economy, they basically just keep it stockpiled in what is basically their checking account at the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve is paying them like a tiny amount of interest on that massive amount of money that's been created. So it's a safe way to kind of get a guaranteed return on that money. But because that money is basically kind of held inert by the big commercial banks, there hasn't been the crazy consumer price inflation that you might otherwise expect after the Federal Reserve's balance sheet goes up that much. So are we going to be spared this time? That's why I wonder about the stagflation issue. They created all this new money into an economy that's basically a bouncing dead cat. And what are they going to do? Is this going to stay in the excess reserves and just not really do anything other than protect the bank's balance sheets? Or is it going to start working its way into the system and then affect consumer prices in an upward way while everyone's losing their jobs and can't get back to work because everyone's scared and the regulators are so awful? Here's someone I wouldn't normally quote, although she's pretty good, Heather McDonald. She's at the Manhattan Institute, but she's done some really good articles on this. But she raises a point too that's kind of beyond the numbers, and it's one of the other serious problems with just shutting people down for so long. She says the focus on saving just one life from the coronavirus, as Cuomo put it in March, to the exclusion of all other considerations, likely will prove a catastrophic failure of policymaking. The devastation to individuals' ability to flourish or even survive may soon become irreversible. So it's really hard to get that fire in your belly back after it's been totally shut down. That's one of the big dangers of this. How long are they going to drag it out, and how many souls will they crush? And by soul, I mean like the desire to be productive, the desire to get out there, do the best you can, as opposed to collect bennies. Now, that's kind of the meaty stuff, I guess. I'm going to take a break and check the chat box, but we're almost done. I just wanted to put a few notes about the whole cultural war aspect and how it relates to the virus panic, and also, the left versus right thing, that dynamic and how it affects this. So let's just check the chat box here quick. What do we got? Well, so one question is, why would governments choose to lock down and bear Large fiscal deficits and stimulus spending. What do they gain by increasing the size of federal debt and pay people government support programs? Well, there's different ways to answer that. Like a cynical way would be to say they, like we said earlier, they just love a crisis. They want power. Why wouldn't they? Another answer is that, well, they're dumb and they don't understand economics and they don't understand the how counterproductive economically it is to the host. Remember, the state is the parasite. It needs, all of its resources have to be produced by someone else. It can move resources around and it can bully people, but it can't produce anything. But there's a lot of people who think the state can just produce things like magic almost. Doesn't need to form capital, doesn't need to, it just consumes and magically you get stuff out of it. But I think there's a really short-sighted policy issue here, and the main thing is they don't realize the devastating effects that they're creating. And even if they do, they're distant, they're far away, and they personally don't have to deal with it. One of the problems with democracy is it encourages public decision makers to think more in terms of the present, because as Hoppe would argue, unlike a king, the king owns the capital value of his kingdom basically, and the future income of his kingdom goes to him and his family and his heirs. Democracy, you've got your leaders who don't own the country. They basically control it, or they own it very temporarily. So their incentive is to maximize income now, maximize power now, and if it affects the so-called capital value of the kingdom, or if it affects the future income generating ability of the kingdom, then that's a different issue for them. What do they care? That's someone else's problem to deal with. So there is a very fundamental institutional problem in parliamentary governments and, you know, democratic legislatures that really focuses on the quick fix, creating a big problem later on. One of our dudes here is wondering when they're going to extend the CERB, which is one of the big new bennies. And yeah, is the wise statement, there's nothing more permanent than a temporary program from the government. Yeah, how much of this stuff is going to get extended? How much are these subsidies for students or people whose jobs you destroyed who need money now? How are you gonna take that away? That would be so cruel, and they need your help, and maybe we should just make it permanent forever. Any new taxes they introduce probably aren't going to go away soon. A friend of mine suggested a little while back, it's like, I bet you they're going to try and increase the GST. And that might be true. They're going to be looking for money. They're not going to want to spend anything, or cut spending on anything. Okay, detour back to, or not detour, let's go back to the thing here. We're almost done. I appreciate anyone who's hung in here this long with me. This is more just fun stuff, not really rigorous or all that sophisticated. But Tim Moen, who's the leader of the Libertarian Party, he's a smart guy, and he's got the philosophy down pretty good, unlike most politicians who are just kind of dumb. Anyway, he has this idea, and I think it's got some validity to it, that the right wants the state to be its dad, and the left wants the state to be its mom. And so now what we have is the ultimate Oedipal mother. So the evil pathological mother in the form of the hyper-medical nanny state. And I think that's interesting. Think about that old Pink Floyd song, Mother from the Wall. And, you know, for some reason that song just plays in my head. But the idea is the state is now like, oh, precious baby, I won't let anything hurt you. You're safe as long as you trust mommy and do what mommy says. Don't question mommy. She's got your best interests at heart. So the state has become our overweening mother. She will kill us to protect us from something bad happening. And on the left-right divide, libertarians, we like to debate, well, who's really worse when it comes down to it, the left or the right, and it kind of depends on the issue in a lot of cases. But on this issue, it seems that the Democrats or the liberal side might be worse, which is surprising because usually the right wing is more associated with the stronger disgust response, you might say. And so like sickness and disease and people sliming and coughing, that might be more offensive to the right than the left. I don't know. But anyway, it seems the Democrats are a lot more terrified, or the left, speaking generically, not just American politics. It seems the left is a lot more scared about the virus stuff than the right is. And this is kind of a generalization. It's not going to be true in all cases. But it just seems to be a pattern. There seems to be a very partisan divide here. Again, when it comes down to ready to return to normal activities, the right, such as it is, seems to be a lot more in favor of doing so, whereas the left seems to be more scared or more worried, or maybe even in a sinister way, they just don't want other people to have fun or produce. Now, I'm not saying this is necessarily what explains this. I'm not saying this is related at all, but I stumbled across some Pew research, and you notice that young white liberals seem to have a really high preponderance of mental health conditions. And I wonder if mental health conditions correlate with fear of viruses or fear of things that people might do, or just correlate maybe with that safetyism culture. I'm not making any conclusions here. I'm just an idiot. I'm just throwing it out there. I don't know what the explanation is. Just something to think about, though. Again, as I mentioned before, parasite prevalence predicts authoritarianism. There's a few interesting papers like this. You can go out and read them if you want. Just kind of interesting to think about. And which kind of people in Canada are the worst kind of people? Who's going to snitch you to the authorities if you only stand 5 feet away from someone instead of 6 feet away? Well, it looks like Atlantic Canada and Quebec have the worst people, the worst snitches. And then it looks like Alberta and BC have the least bad people, or the least likely to snitch. So, I don't know. What's the deal with snitchers? Snitchers make me sick. Like, you would call the cops because someone's sitting in their backyard too close to someone else, or someone's standing in an empty parking lot. Oh my God, he's going to infect somebody. And that's where we're going to wrap things up here with my absolute horror at these lockdown fanatics and the tyranny that they're advocating. So you want to remember always, whenever you're talking about getting the government involved or getting the law involved, hey, there's got to be a law to stop this. You're talking about guns and badges, and every law will ultimately be enforced with violence. That's how the government works. The lockdown fanatics really don't appreciate the kind of government oppression they're bringing into play over something that really doesn't justify it. Also, they're incredibly blasé about the economic devastation of this lockdown. And I think some of it's good faith, it's genuine belief among some of these lockdown fanatics that the state can just create so much economic value if you would just have the power to make it so, that they really don't worry about the private economy being suffocated. But remember, like, whether you're libertarian or not, all your public stuff, all your government stuff needs to consume resources of the private economy. So again, you kill the host and the parasite dies. The parasite can get so fat that the host can't support it anymore. They're incredibly ignorant about the economics of recovery. I don't think they understand what they're bringing about in the long-term devastation. Like, the thing is, a lot of the people, there's a big correlation between, it seems, people who haven't lost their jobs or people with higher incomes supporting the lockdown. And that kind of makes sense because you think, like, say you can work from home, you're more likely a higher income person than someone who's got to drive a delivery truck every day or got to go make pizzas somewhere. The devastation that comes about because of the sheer lack of understanding about what it takes for the economy to be productive and help people increase their wealth is, I think, one of the big motivating issues behind supporting the lockdown. But I think there's also this, not just this economic ignorance, but for some people, I think they want to use the lockdown to actually hurt people. And the most obvious way you can think about this is something like with the lockdown fanatics and Trump. It's like there's been a lot of people who talked about how, Trump is garbage, but he's hard to beat because his economy is pretty good. Well, it seems that there's kind of this motivation among certain people who want the economy bad to hurt their political enemies. You kind of see it around here too. Like, Jason Kenney's been absolutely terrible as a premier so far, but you can see it in some of the rhetoric directed against him, where it's like, oh, the economic consequences of the lockdown show that the right wing is stupid, or this leader is stupid, or libertarians are stupid. A lot of people like to say, oh, the libertarians can't deal with the virus situation, and they think that's like a big argument against it. But if anything, I think the libertarian argument is strengthened by all of this, and it's pretty much panned out exactly how we would expect. So yeah, the fanatics have begun to kind of ignore evidence. They're ignoring the evolving situation, and they just keep falling upon these arguments, and it's kind of just a power play at this point. Like, oh, Calgary, you can't, you'll become New York. It's like, we'll never be New York. We'll never be Italy. Everywhere's different. The justification isn't there for the deadliness, supposedly, of this virus and justifying the lockdown. So, the lockdown's garbage. Anyone who supports it at this point, I think, is pretty bad person. The debate is over, in my opinion. It's just, I think, hopefully, some politicians know they're kind of trapped based on what they've done, and they're trying to find an out. I think that's our only hope. Or maybe, mass unrest, which fights back against the lockdowns. That'll be good too. There was a really big anti-lockdown protest in Toronto. You should go online and check out a video of it. It's really interesting and encouraging to watch. Anyhow, that's basically it. So I think we've covered all of that. Went a little longer than I planned, and after a few shots of whiskey, hopefully I remained coherent. I'm gonna check the chat box here. What are you guys talking about? Somebody's saying Kenney is the worst premier in history. Yes, that appears to be true so far, because he's basically just Rachel Notley in drag. It would be nice if he would prove us wrong, but doesn't look like that's going to happen. Well, I don't know. So this is, we'll save this in the YouTube channel so anyone can go back and watch it later or whatever. You can write me or send me a message or contact me through the Secret Society if you have any questions or you want to see where any of the sources or anything came from. I think that's good. Any questions before we go? Oh, someone asking, why is the stock market still so high? Well, cronyism is a big thing. There's a lot of bailouts happening, so that'll protect some future earnings, and in the front runner investors can kind of get in there. And there's an idea that there might be a recovery, and really things fell so hard so fast, and the underlying reason is, again, not because the financial system exploded, although that could be a resulting consequence later on, but the government just kind of hit the switch and turned things off. So in theory, they could turn things on and you could slowly recover, and maybe it would be a different situation. I don't know. Maybe people just expect things to kind of work out over time, or they see how much money is being created and they know that's going to go into some financial assets. Why is the stock market so high? Is it so high? Maybe it should be lower. I don't know. maybe it's gonna go way lower over the next few years. We'll probably have a pretty nasty bear market. And there's the cat causing trouble. I don't know. What do you think? I think we're gonna wrap up, guys. That was interesting. I think technologically everything worked out okay. Kind of an amateur host, so I hope that worked out for everyone. I will talk to you guys later. And I believe, oh, before I go, the Secret Society normally would be 4th Tuesday of the month for the next one, which would be the 26th. Is that right? But anyway, that would be 1 week from today. It's possible that on Monday things open up again. So we might have some venues. I don't know. I think the government's supposed to say whether the restaurants and bars and stuff can be open tomorrow. So I guess we'll find out. So just keep an eye up on the event pages, and we'll try and keep you posted. Eventually we'll have the normal meetings again. And maybe we'll do this live stream stuff again sometime too. I don't know if people enjoyed it. I would appreciate some feedback, because I have no idea what this has been like to watch and listen to. That's it. Talk to you guys later. Oh, how do I turn it off? Oh, now you guys get to sit and watch me awkwardly try and turn it off. How embarrassing. Oh my goodness. Okay, talk to you later.